Join me, all of you, loud
Okay.
in Al-Fatih. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, Sirata al-ladzina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim wa lad-dallin. So today is the second of the lectures in the series of History of Islam. Our speaker did a fantastic job on his first lecture about a month ago. Just those of you who are not familiar with this series, it would be the last Sunday of every month. And you will get, those of you who are on the mailing list, you will get the announcement ahead of time. And anyone who is not, let us know, we'll put you on. So, um, usually they say our speaker does not need an introduction, and this speaker really does not need an introduction, and I'm not going to spend half an hour to introduce him anyway, because usually people end up doing that. Very briefly, Dr. Ovamir Anjum is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toledo and holds the chair of Imam Khattab chair in Islamic Studies at the university. He has been a professor now for a few years, and last week, week and a half ago, we had a very nice program around his latest scholarly work in which he translated an old Arabic text, uh, Madarij al-Salikin. And it was a lively discussion on that. This is a monumental work that he has done. Um, but I am grateful to him personally that he has committed to give this series of lectures. Definitely.
Thank you very much. All right, Sarah, I'm trying to make it project. Maybe something on my end. Okay, good. Excellent. That does it. Okay. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Today my topic is Islamic history, why and what. What counts as Islamic history, and why ought we to learn Islamic history? Some justifications, some philosophical reflections on history, and what we might call theory of Islamic history. What does history mean? If you don't mind, I'll make it a little interactive. So, yeah.
It's his story.
His story, okay.
It's a series of facts linked by his story.
Okay. One, as somebody said, one damn fact after another. What else?
It's a narrative of the past.
Okay, very good. Narrative. A narrative is a new word we got. I was talking about facts and we got narrative. There is a little tension between fact and narrative. The thing is that we don't ever have all the facts about the past. And not only do we not have all the facts, we have in fact a very narrow version of selection of facts that somebody has collected. And that's why history is never neutral. History can be done better or worse, but it's never merely a matter of one damn fact after another, because nobody would want to learn it. For instance, how many people know how many blades of grass are there outside in the parking lot? It's a fact, but it's a fact I doubt anybody ever even thought about knowing. So we don't want to know facts. We want to know facts that fit into some narrative of what is important in life, right? So the ancient way of doing it, pre-modern way, history was called um, tarikh for the Arabs. And from tarikh, it went from Arabic, it went into Persian, and Turkish, and Urdu, and all of these different Islamic languages. And I use the word Islamic, right? That's a little trick there. When you say something is Islamic, that means it is somehow theologically has to do with belief in God and the Prophet Muhammad, alayhi salam. When I say something is Islamic, that's the way people use the word italic, meaning related to the civilization, but not necessarily it. So Islamic means all of these cultural phenomena that are not necessarily religiously Islamic, but historically they've been connected to Islamic civilization. And Persian, for example, is an Islamic language. It's not Islamic because you could be just as good as a Muslim if you don't know Persian, but if Islamic in the sense that there is a good portion of the riches of Islamic tradition available in Persian or in Urdu and Turkish and so on. So in Islamic languages, the word we use is tarikh, which comes from dating things. In English, it is called chronicles. Chroniclers, old historians were usually court chroniclers who would write important dates when the conquest happened, when which king defeated which king, and usually how many people were killed, how many people were in each army. And when we look at ancient records, this is usually the kind of stuff that is preserved in Egyptian history, Assyrian history, ancient histories that we have access to. And usually when you look at the record, you realize that different people are reporting the same event completely differently. Meaning who won usually depends on who's writing history. So even if such a simple thing as a fact of a war taking place, one side usually killing off the other, but when the court historians of both sides would write it, they would write differently who won. So modern history, I guess before modern history, the emergence of modern history is a result of human beings learning writing, but also developing a sense of other people and a sense of passage of time. And then there is always a theory of how time passes. So ancient Greeks, for example, thought of time as cyclical, meaning people go up and then come down, and the same story repeats itself. So there's victories, there are defeats, there are triumphs, there are failures, and the same thing starts over again. With the introduction of, or at least that's the standard narrative, with the introduction of monotheism, and the idea, particularly the idea of one God who's watching over history, and then with the idea specifically of the day of judgment, of a final destination. And we don't know which one came first, but Greeks would believed in a circular history going indefinitely, same kinds of things happening over and over, whereas in the biblical tradition, the Abrahamic tradition, as you might call it, you get a linear history in which humanity is moving toward a certain end, certain conclusion, right? The other thing that we find in the biblical history, particularly in the Old Testament, is divine intervention. God will intervene to choose certain people and make them his favorite people, and do so without explanation, right? So Israelites become his favorite people. This is not something that you could predict based on some law, some norm, something more universal than just the fact that God chose certain people. Now, if you're thinking of history that way, your view of history changes because you don't know what's going to happen next. Who is going to be chosen by God next? Similarly, if you read the Old Testament, you find a view of history in which God is choosing certain people, punishing certain people, and God is somewhat unpredictable. And then at the end, God promises that there is going to be either a kingdom of heaven for Christians or some kind of day of judgment in the world in which people are going to be morally judged and evaluated. This introduces the idea of linear history moving toward a certain end. This is different from the Greeks because the Greeks believe that history is circular, just keeps happening over and over. Same thing is happening. We're not, as humanity, moving toward anything. Okay. This it is in this context that I'm going to place Islamic or Quranic view of history and talk about why it's especially interesting. So let's go back to our question of what is history. History is a factual story, so it's not just story, it is a factual story. About events of some significance before one's time. Otherwise, it's journalism or, a contestation of what's happening. History usually is what has passed and the main facts and narratives have settled, which is reconstructed. History is always reconstructed. History is never just there. It's always retold. Some people would take certain facts and would say this or that fact is central to this story, with the consideration of chronology through reports and other data. So usually history has to depend on reports. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points in the definition of history that I have pointed out as being significant, which we are going to keep seeing these things. Facts, time, passage of time, reconstruction, chronology, and reports. The writing of history is known since ancient times. The first major work of history that Western civilization possesses, and because of the universality of the Western civilization as a result of colonialism, other civilizations' histories have been either eliminated sometimes completely or otherwise subordinated to Western history. And therefore, even when we as Muslims talk about history, we often have to start by at least translating our history into Western terms. Now, I'm going to talk about the relationship between Islam and the West, which is not as straightforward as an opposition merely, meaning that Islam draws on the same basic elements as the Western civilization, which is very different, say, if you were to do Chinese civilization or Indian civilization or other Eastern civilizations. Western civilization is often said it's a tension between two traditions, two cities. Anybody guess what I'm talking about? What are the two cities? Sparta. We have martial spirit here. What are the two cities that twain shall never meet? It's said about them. Athens and Jerusalem. Right? Athens and Jerusalem. That's often said about the Western civilization, that its foundations are in two cities, right? So Jerusalem is what gave Christianity, and before that, Judaism. And Athens gave philosophy. Now, what's interesting is that in Islamic civilization, Athens is central. Jerusalem is central, right? And when you read the Quran, do you find any mention of the story of Jerusalem? No mention of anything that happened in Jerusalem? How about Isa, Jesus?
Doesn't say it.
Well, I'm talking about the narrative of Jerusalem. Of course, Al-Qudus, Bayt al-Maqdis, or Al-Ard allati barakna fiha, that's all about Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is mentioned by other names.
Yeah.
But the point is, when I say the narrative of Jerusalem, I don't mean the story of the city of Jerusalem, but that story of prophets, of God intervening in the world and sending a prophet, whether it's Abraham or Moses or Jesus or any of the other prophets. That story is one of the pillars of the Western civilization. And guess what? Does the Quran concern itself with Jerusalem? The story of Isa, the story of Musa, Jesus and Moses and Abraham? Right. Now, does the Quran mention Athens? Is there anything about Athens that's mentioned in the Quran? Aristotle? Plato? Porphyry? Proclus? These are major figures of the Near East, important in the West, but not mentioned in the Quran at all. And it actually is a very significant fact. The reason it's a significant fact is because the Quran comes in the Near East. Remember we talked about the Fertile Crescent, or what I call the corridor where humanity is born, the corridor of humanity, going from Egypt all the way to Persia, and in between we have Syria and Iraq. That corridor, that's where all major human civilizations are born. That's where the first cities are born. And nearly every civilization either comes from there or goes and conquers those cities. That city, that corridor, is what Islam comes very close to. Islam is born in one of the wings of that corridor. Remember we talked about that? So this corridor has two wings. Think of it as a butterfly. One of the wings is the Arabian Peninsula, and the other is the Greek world, right? The Greek world. Greece is very, if you start from a place like Syria, you go in one direction, you'll end up in Greece or Turkey, right? If you go in the other direction, you'll end up close to Mecca and Medina. In this world, as Islam is born, very quickly Islam and Islam is connected to this corridor, right? And not only that, the most remarkable thing is that the Quran is familiar with the stories that are taking place here. Okay? And let me actually share with you I will have trouble finding it. I don't want to waste your time. So I think about last month, I saw a description of an academic conference where one of the main thesis of the conference or called for papers for scholars of early Islam was You just have to trust me because I can't show you the writing. And as historians, we're very skeptical of people just talking. So I'm familiar with I'm aware of this problem. This professor at Oregon State University, he says that here is the problem we have with early Islam. Many of the stories in the Quran that are polemics with Christianity, with various Christian groups, they show an enormous awareness of, a deep awareness of what is going on in Christian theology. The various groups that are Nestorians, the Jacobites, the Copts, the Chalcedonians, they're debating the nature of Christ, they're debating Trinity, they have problems with preservation, what goes in the canon and what is not in the canon. And the Quran seems to know all of that. And we also know for a fact now that the Arabs did not know this stuff. Right? So it starts with these two premises. And then it says, therefore the Quran could not have been composed by a man like Muhammad because this information was simply not available to anybody in Arabic. Arabic was barely a literate language. And therefore, the Quran must have been written in the 9th century and not the 7th century. So we start with a problem. The problem is that the Quran contains information that is impossible for any Arab to possess at that time, because you are isolated from this corridor and you have a language that simply does not have any such knowledge. On the other hand, you also insist that, well, the only source of knowledge that is available is historical, and therefore the Quran must not have been written in the 7th century Arabia, in Mecca, a very, very isolated place, right? So what this conference is doing is it's taking a premise. There is a premise, there is a hidden premise that we are supposed to not challenge. What is that? Can anybody tell me? What is the hidden premise in this
In which part?
formulation of the problem? The formulation of the problem for the conference is the Quran contains information that Muhammad couldn't have had as a man. What's that?
Must have been revealed.
Well, but that's not a possibility according to the way the conference, the call is formulated.
Directly by God.
The premise of revelation did not happen.
The premise is that it's not possible that it was revealed. Therefore, we must look for it in 9th century when Muslims actually conquer this corridor and become aware of the knowledge it's contained there, right? But for Muslims, and really for any unbiased historian, that would be a possibility at least, that maybe Muhammad's source of knowledge was not historical, but divine. Now we do have, in fact, carbon dated copies of pages of the Quran that go all the way back to the 7th century. Right? So at Birmingham University, there were some copies of the Quran, palimpsests they're called, found in Yemen, which were carbon dated to 7th century Arabia, or 7th century, within 30 years, give or take. But that places the Quran squarely in the 7th century, very close to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. But my point is that the way the call for papers, this academic call for papers is formulated is that is not a possibility. Because revelation is impossible, the only way you can explain this Quranic information, this Quranic awareness of these profound Christological debates, is by saying that it came later, after Muslims already conquered this corridor. Yes,
But
Dr. Anjum.
wasn't there a sizable presence of Christians within the Arabian Peninsula? And, and that is fact, that there were tribes, Christian tribes, and those tribes most likely were the custodians of those traditions and debates in Christianity.
So the first part is correct, the second part is not. That is, these Arab Christians, the Arab Christians that we have some in Yemen and we had in Najran, which is close to Yemen on the way from Hijaz to Yemen. You had Christians, but if you look at their Christological sophistication, it's not comparable to what you have in the Syriac language, for example, or the Greek languages in the north, in the corridor, if you will. So these people could not have been the source of the sophisticated knowledge. Not that Christianity exists, but what are the problems with Trinity? What are these ancient interpretation of texts that most Christians had even forgotten about? What are these ancient references in the Old Testament, which were, in fact, many of them were not even available to scholars at that time and became available only later. All kinds of issues that, again, this is not my formulation of the problem. This is the formulation in the field of scholars who are operating outside of the religious tradition. And my point is simply to point out the way that these narratives are constructed, even in the academy, even today, where we should know better. Yes, Dr.
Yeah. When was that conference? This one a contemporary one?
Yes, very contemporary. This was this year, a couple of months ago.
Yeah. If you can give us a link to either.
Yeah, I wish if I have a few minutes, I could go and find it now, but
I mean, they were not isolated. Mecca was like a center of trade, and you have travelers to see it, Yemen all the time, twice a year.
right, great question, wonderful question. So you had
Waraqah bin Nawfal.
Waraqah ibn Nawfal, that is correct. No, those are wonderful questions.
You had Jews as well.
But these people at the time did not possess the kind of knowledge about debates in Christianity, historical debates in Christianity. It's one thing to be an Arab who converted to Christianity and learn somewhere, right, where you would learn one or two versions of what the debate is about Trinity, right?
That amount of information.
But to say that early Christians, in fact, as we know now, were Jewish, who did not believe in the divinity of Jesus until Paul. And you have these problems in the Bible, you have these problems in early Christian history. Where does this come from? In the Quran. These people would not have known. And if those debates existed, in order to be able to give an authoritative account of what is going wrong, you needed to have mastered that literature, not merely passing familiarity. So that's the question, right? So it's not that you would have heard that these things possibly existed, but to then be able to authoritatively challenge required. Now, of course, these scholars are not saying that the Quran is right. Of course, they're atheists often. That's not their concern, is not who is right. Their concern is how would have the Quran known that these debates existed? Now, what's also interesting, then, my original point is that the Quran is very directly engaged with this one half of Western civilization, Jerusalem, but completely leaves out the other half, Athens. There's no mention of any philosopher. Now, you might say, okay, so what? Well, fine, makes sense. Okay, the Quran is interested only in Jerusalem, But once you begin to look at this corridor, right, and this is a modern scholarship of late antiquity, the centuries before Islam, 2 or 3 centuries before Islam, that is the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries of Common Era, they're called late antiquity. Late antiquity scholarship that is now much more available than it was, say, even 50 years ago, it shows us that this corridor, especially Iraq, northern Syria, they were rife with philosophical debates among Christians and between Christians and Buddhists, Christians and Zoroastrians, Christians and pagans. And they were using, Christianity had become totally Platonized. Christianity had understood itself through Platonism, through Plato. The idea of Trinity could not make sense except if you understood certain versions of Plato. It's not there, you can't understand the theory of hypostasis and so on in the Bible. My point is, the Quran rejects or ignores all of that completely. In the same mix, the Quran picks up one tradition and seems to know extremely careful, deep knowledge of what's going on, and completely leaves out the other tradition. Once you know late antiquity, then you have new light on what the Quran is trying to do. Right? And that's what modern, actually, is quite exciting scholarship about Quranic exegesis. But the point is that a same story where the Quran seems to know extremely well its sources and it's creating an account that is very deliberate and not accidental. You find that in the way history is understood. Remember I said the Greeks understood their history as what? Cyclical. And the biblical tradition understood its history as linear, moving toward, you could say, this modern version in secular world of progress, history of progress, human beings are constantly improving. Well, you don't have the idea of progress, but you do have an idea of history moving inexorably toward an end. Now, the Quranic history is very deliberately both. So there is a linear element in Quranic history, meaning that there is a day of judgment. However, unlike God in the Old Testament, God in the Quran is predictable, knowable through attributes. You see sifat or asma in the Quran, the 99 names of God, right, that appear in the tradition. They're not actually 99 in the Quran, but 99. The idea that there are 99 names actually comes from the hadith of the Prophet, but the Quran gives names of the Quran, of God, right? What does a name mean? A name is an attribute, it's a reference to an attribute. God is all merciful. God is always merciful. God holds people accountable. God is just. What do they say? What do these attributes say? That God does same things always. In other words, God is not fickle and changing and unpredictable, but rather God is always the same. This idea does not appear in the Bible. You don't have names of God in the Bible. Whereas in the Quran, this is the center of theology. God is knowable through these attributes of how God relates to humans. So that adds a Greek element to history. How? Because history becomes predictable. If there is a conflict going on, you could know that God is always going to support certain kind of people. And then the Quran, in fact, says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ أَجَلٍ. Every people, every nation has a appointed time. When the time comes, it's not going to be moved back and forth. Similarly, God always supports certain kind of people. There are oppressors, and disbelievers that are always punished and so on. This adds predictability. But also, in fact, now the Quran goes and gives a new version. Muslims would say the true version of the old biblical tales. So, for example, Abraham is chosen not arbitrarily, but because he was a righteous man. Israelites are a chosen people, but they were chosen not because of their genetics or DNA or because they had a special deal with God, but because Abraham made a deal with God that he was sincere, he succeeded in the tasks, he had a sacrifice, he was willing to sacrifice even his son, and as a result of that, he was given a pledge, and that pledge was only given to people of his children who were truthful and righteous, not because of their biology or their tribal superiority. So the Quran takes an Old Testament story and now changes it. Now it becomes a story of ethics, story of covenant, but the covenant is not arbitrary. Covenant is bilateral. Whereas if you look at the Jewish interpretations of why the Jewish people are chosen, well, Jewish people are chosen because Abraham is a man who makes a deal with God. Abraham, in fact, is not even clearly monotheist in the Bible. There is debate among scholars whether Abraham was a monotheist. The Bible is unclear about it. People would say that he had one God, but the idea that there is no other God that exists, that doesn't appear in the Bible. That's why he was a henotheist and not a monotheist. In the Quran, Abraham is a monotheist and ethical and moral, and he makes a covenant with God and keeps it, and that is when he's given this promise. So now what the Quran is doing is that it's taking a biblical story and giving it a universal ethical interpretation. So that's why when I say the Quran brings both the Athenian content, which is Greeks are trying to look for universal laws, things that are always happening, and the Jerusalem story, Abrahamic story, in which God is directly intervening in unpredictable ways. They're both brought together in the Quran. So now when you look at Islamic history or Quranic history, you find that both of these elements are in fact present in every story that is told. That God is in charge, yes, but also God acts according to certain patterns. The idea of God acting in patterns, وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا, you will not find a change, an alteration, or disruption in divine pattern of action that appears as the Quranic version. And now that plays an important role in how Muslims understand history. And the culmination of that reflection on history appears in Ibn Khaldun, who is called the first social scientist and the first philosopher in history, because before that, history is often understood, that is before Ibn Khaldun, who lived in the 14th century of Common Era, 8th century of Hijri calendar. History is seen as either one damn thing after another, or a pattern of cyclical action that you can follow. In the Quran, and what you find in the Ibn Khaldun is that both the moral element, the linear progress, and the laws of history interact. So that is, if you will, the philosophy of Islamic history is that it places itself deliberately between these two traditions, but does so very deliberately and carefully. Okay, So now I'm going to ask the question, what is Islamic history? What counts as Islamic history? Is the history of Muslims. What makes history, what makes facts Islamic?
They're qualified by the Quran or the Sunnah.
Qualified how?
That depends on your belief, the theology, and peaceful law, I guess.
Islamic history.
Okay? Let's hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Yes.
Islamic history does not mean the history of Islam. To me, it means Islamic history is the people who live in the Islamic dominions.
Okay, so the history of Islamic civilization.
Right.
Okay? Yes.
To the best of my understanding, Islam's from the day of Adam to the Prophet Muhammad. So it's a series of revelations from Adam
Excellent. Right?
to.
So that's a very important point, which is that the Quran does not talk about the history of Muslim people, does it? Muslim people, if you understand Islam is starting with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the 14 centuries after until today, the Quran doesn't talk about that, does it? What does the Quran talk about?
All nations before Prophet Muhammad's call.
All nations, but not all nations, not quite all nations.
Christians and
Divine.
Jews.
Mostly Abrahamic tradition,
Yeah.
right? It is primarily, with some exceptions, it is primarily concerned with the biblical tradition, the story of Abraham, and before Abraham, Noah and Adam, and after Abraham. And then there are some Arab prophets that are not in the Bible, such as Hud and Saleh, the Arab prophets. But all of them are joined together by one thing, which is that God sent the same message to people. And then people responded in different ways, mostly they rejected, and then the end came, God's judgment came. So the Quranic story is, the Quranic heroes are different from the heroes of material history or civilizational history. The Quranic heroes are who? Prophets. Quranic heroes are prophets. Now, what is the most frequently mentioned, frequently repeated story in the Quran? Story of Musa. Story of Musa and Pharaoh. Now, if you look at that story, it's actually quite significant once you understand the history behind it. If you think about it, what is Pharaoh? Who is Pharaoh? Pharaoh is who? Yeah.
The most.
Exactly. Pharaoh is the name of the kings of the most advanced civilization up till that point in human history. It's the Egyptian civilization, right? And what would their answer here?
Can you clarify that more? Is he the most influential at that time, worldwide, or just in that region? Pharaoh, because he was a tyrant. He was.
Okay, so I don't know what worldwide means. The world hasn't globalized yet, so people are living in different parts of the world. But this is the center of the world, right? This is the center of world civilization as well as world populations, the Middle East, which doesn't mean the people in China or wherever else they're living. But as far as the central regions of the world, Egypt is hands down the richest, the most powerful, and the most technologically advanced nation at the time, which is about 4,000 years or 3,000 years ago that Moses would have come, 3,200, 3,400, according to, if you put the numbers together. So on the one hand, you have this great civilization, the greatest civilization of the time, and the Quran actually describes a very sophisticated political mechanism, as well as the gardens and the irrigation mechanism. Either describes, the Quran refers to it, and the fact that they could build really, really high towers, pyramids. This was technological marvel. But then you look at the Quranic story, and what is that about? What is the Quranic story? Who is the hero of the Quranic story? Musa, Moses. Moses is the hero. And who is Moses? Is he an engineer? Is he a great political democratic leader?
Prophet.
He's a prophet, and not only a prophet, he's a fugitive. Right? He's a fugitive, and he belongs to a people, the Israelites, who were oppressed and enslaved. And he goes to challenge challenge Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, when he's arguing against Moses, and this is very frequent in the Quran, right? Moses is told that you are just a fugitive, you ran away. Look at us. Look at these beautiful gardens. Look at this immaculate engineering. What do you have to contribute? So the Quran, if you will, does not mince words. The Quran puts all of the greatest civilization at the time and against its message of monotheism, and basically says all of this knowledge of engineering and politics, and in fact, if you look at actually the description of how Pharaoh acts in the Quran, rather than the stereotypes that sometimes Muslims have, which is that he was just a tyrant. But he was a tyrant, but he was also a very sophisticated political mechanism. He was, in a way, you could say, this was a kind of republic. How do we know that? Well, whenever the Quran mentions Pharaoh doesn't just give a command. He actually asks his mala, his ministers, and he convinces them using arguments in a way that a president or a prime minister today would. They have to buy into his argument, and they do buy into his argument. So they have arguments, and he has to ensure. You see, what Pharaoh says when Moses challenges him in Surah Taha, for example, is that these people have come to destroy your way of life. لِيَذْهَبَا بِطَرِيقَتِكُمُ الْمُثْلَى. They have come to destroy your way of life. He is making the exact kind of argument that perhaps is familiar to us, isn't it? Yes.
It seems like a lot of ancient and even contemporary history is about justifying power and why this group should be in power and trying to, like the Habsburgs, trying to justify their rule through Charlemagne, things like that. But this kind of turns it on its head a little bit, so it just kind of deconstructs that.
Yeah.
Who should be in power and for what reason?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great word, deconstruct. In fact, in Surah Al-Shu'ara, sorry, I don't remember the name of this surah. If you look at the dialogue between Moses and Pharaoh, it's very interesting. Moses shows up and says, God has called upon me to invite you to God and stop oppressing these people, the Israelites. And Moses and Pharaoh says, who are you? You are a fugitive, and we raised you in our palace. So you were a criminal. We have all, if you will, the legal legitimacy, the civilization, the technology, and we have taken care. And then Moses, his answer is so remarkable. It is exactly as you said, it's deconstruction. He says, as for your favors that you're talking to me about, وَتِلْكَ نِعْمَةٌ تَمُنُّهَا عَلَيَّ عَلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. وتلك نعمة تمن على بني إسرائيل أنا عبدت بني إسرائيل. The blessing that you're talking about is that you have enslaved my people. So he cuts through the fat and he says, you're talking about, oh, we have favors upon you. You have enslaved my people. That's the reality of it. So Moses almost does a political critique of Pharaoh's claim that we are the lords of your people. We raised you in our palace, right? He is doing exactly what all imperialists and colonizers do. Choose certain people and use them to divide, use them to make their arguments. And Moses doesn't go for that. Moses identifies with his people and said, you have enslaved my people. That's that. So going back to the larger point about Quranic history, the Quranic history pits the greatest civilization against a man who has nothing but truth, monotheism, and oppression that he's fighting against. And the hero of the Quran is not Pharaoh. When you hear a lot of Muslim preachers and Muslim stories, you would think that Pharaoh should be the hero. Because all that matters is power, what matters is civilization, what matters is engineering, what matters is worldly knowledge of how to run the world. But the Quran inverts all of that expectation, and it is a man who has nothing but this message of monotheism, truth. That becomes Quranic hero, and then Pharaoh becomes the villain. So those are just some reflections on what it means to do Islamic history. When Marxists do history, right, one of the major impetus in modern period of doing history was Marxist history. And when they do history, what do they look at? They look at modes of production. They look at economic conditions, right? Those become the most important facts. When Enlightenment folks, when Enlightenment historians did history, Gibbon and others, Toynbee, when they did history, what mattered to them was civilization, because as often British or French historians, that's what they were colonizing the world. That's how they wanted to look at the world. Much of history that we do today is history written from those perspectives, from material perspective of who won the wars. And the subversion of that, the opposition to that, came from Marxists who said, well, no, let's look at the proletariat, modes of production, who was being persecuted economically. When you look at the Quranic history, the heroes are, and the real struggle is between truth and falsehood, the truth of God, truth of monotheism, and falsehood. Now, when that becomes clear, then the answer to the question of what is Islamic history is not that history about Muslims only, because it could happen before Islam, right? Was the story of Moses with Pharaoh, is it Islamic history? Well, it's in the Quran. How much more Islamic could it be? Jesus, is that Islamic history? Okay, so those are the models, the paradigms of Islamic history. So what makes history Islamic, in other words, is that what is your central story? What is your central paradigm? And this could happen outside of the circle of Islam. And you could have Muslims who do not care about truth, and their story is just the story of Prince Fulan ibn Fulan killing and fighting Prince Fulan ibn Fulan. And there's nothing Islamic about that, right? So you could learn everything about Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you will learn very little about Islam, right? In their struggle. So that is my way to say that we should think about Islamic history in new light, and in the light that is given to us by the Quran. Thank you very much. Questions, thoughts? Yes, sir.
Yes. As far as the Hebrew Bible goes, I think obviously at the time of Abraham, the whole thing of absolute monotheism was not fully developed yet. But I think you can say that through the Hebrew Bible, there is a progression toward that as you go historically through the books, and especially if you accept some of the apocryphal books too.
Yeah, so that's a great question.